John Bell woke up with a hand around his throat. There was no one in the room. No footsteps. No movement. Just the pressure, tightening and tightening until he couldn't call for help. Lucy reached him first. She tried prying his jaw open, thinking he was choking, but his mouth wouldn't move. It was locked in place, as if someone was holding it shut. And then they heard it, a woman's laugh, soft, right beside the bed. John's sons ran in with lanterns. The room was empty, but the laugh didn't stop. It got louder, brighter, almost cheerful. John tried to sit up, reaching for Lucy's arm. His legs buckled the moment he put weight on them, and he collapsed beside the bed, gasping, clawing at the air. And just before he lost consciousness, the voice whispered in his ear, "I told you I'd kill you, Jack." When it was over, Lucy went to fetch his medicine. Instead of the bottle they'd been using for weeks, she found a small glass vial she'd never seen before. No label, no explanation. And when they fed a single drop of its contents to the family cat, the cat died instantly. In the winter of 1820, the Bell family understood what the voice had been promising for years. Its final act had begun. The Bell family believed they were living quiet, ordinary lives on the Tennessee frontier. Good soil, steady harvests, neighbors close enough to count on, but far enough to keep the world peaceful. But in the months before John Bell's death, the sense of peace began to fracture. It started with small things, noises inside the walls, taps that came at odd hours, scratching under the floors. Frontier homes made sounds, and for a while, the family treated it that way. Logs shift, animals wander, wind gets into every crack. But these sounds didn't behave like the house settling. They followed people from room to room. They stopped the second someone stepped outside with a lantern and picked up again the moment they came back in. The family prayed aloud to drown it out. Whatever was in the house seemed to enjoy the attention. Then, sometime in the winter of 1817, the noises turned into speech. A whisper first, a voice next. Clear enough to call them by name from the shadows. No one knew why it chose the Bell family. No one knew what it wanted. But everyone who stepped inside that cabin came away saying the same thing. The Bell Witch was real, and she was only getting started. I'm your host, Robert Barber. Tonight's story takes us to the Tennessee frontier, to a farmhouse where whispers grew into a voice no one could explain. A family under siege, a community divided. This is the story of the Bell Witch and the voice that refused to be silenced. And this is State of the Unknown. When people talk about the Bell Witch now, they usually start with the voice. But in the beginning, it was just noise. By the fall of 1817, John Bell had been farming that land for years. He'd moved his family from North Carolina to what was the Red River settlement, hoping for good soil and a quieter life. By all accounts, he got both. The farm did well. The family was respected, and John even served as an elder in the church. Not long before the noises began, John Bell had reported something unusual in his cornfield. He said he saw an animal he couldn't explain. something with the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. It ran off before he could get close, and he tried to put it out of his mind. But after that sighting, the house stopped feeling like a safe place to go at night. It started with a soft, persistent tapping in the walls, the kind of sound you'd blame on mice or beetles at first. Then came the scratching under the floorboards, like claws raking over the planks from below. At bedtime, they'd hear what sounded like someone gnawing on the bedposts. When John or one of the boys got up, lit a candle and checked, there was nothing there. No animal, no damage that they could see. The knocks on the doors came next. Not a vague thud, but a clear rap, rap, rap like knuckles on solid wood. They'd open the door and find an empty yard, the night quiet and the field still. After a while, they stopped bothering to check because every time they did, whatever it was went silent until they sat back down. Then it would start again. At first, the family tried to explain it away. Frontier houses weren't airtight. Logs shifted. Roofs creaked. Wildlife did what wildlife does. You tell yourself to push through, that you're tired and that you're hearing things. But the pattern got harder to ignore. The sound seemed to track them from room to room. If Lucy went into the kitchen, the scratching followed the direction of her footsteps. If John stepped out on the porch with a lantern to make a point of checking every corner, the house would fall absolutely quiet behind him. As soon as he stepped back inside and closed the door, the noise returned, right over his head. The children started complaining that their beds shook at night. They said they could feel something tugging on the covers, pulling the blankets off their feet. One of the younger boys told Lucy it felt like a cat jumping onto the mattress and walking around, except there was nothing there when he opened his eyes. The Bells were religious people, so their first response wasn't to call a medium or a fortune teller. They read scripture out loud. They knelt together and prayed for protection, for peace in the house, for whatever this was to stop. It didn't stop. If anything, praying seemed to give it an audience. The knocks grew louder, the scratching more violent, and after a while, they started to hear something new under all that, a faint, unintelligible muttering, as if someone was trying to form words just outside the edge of their hearing. Night after night, the family lay awake listening to it. The house that had once been quiet enough to hear a dog bark across the river now felt crowded with something they couldn't see.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Maple syrup and being polite. I'm Valerie, host of Canadian Creepies, the podcast that digs up stories polite history would rather forget. Cold cases that never found justice, haunted places that refuse to stay quiet, and folklore with a dark side you've probably never heard. If true crime, paranormal mysteries, and unsettling Canadian history are your thing, you'll want to tune in. New episodes every week wherever you get your podcasts. Canadian Creepies, exploring and exposing the shadows of the true north.
When the voice finally came through clearly, it didn't start with some grand announcement. According to later accounts from the family and their neighbors, it began as a low whisper that grew more distinct over time, like someone practicing. Bits of words, half phrases, then full sentences. Before long, there was no question. Something in that house was speaking, and it knew who it was speaking to. Lucy Bell said she heard it first in her bedroom, using her name in the dark when she thought everyone else was asleep. The children started hearing their own names called from empty rooms. Sometimes it sounded like a stranger. Other times it sounded like each other. That was one of the unnerving things people kept coming back to. This voice could mimic. As the voice grew stronger, people in the community started looking for a name to give it. According to several early accounts, The voice sometimes referred to itself as a spirit or witch, depending on its mood, especially when arguing with visiting ministers. Neighbors picked up on the witch part almost immediately. In a deeply religious, early 1800s frontier community, anything that spoke clearly from an empty room fit their understanding of witchcraft more than anything else. Before long, visitors were calling it the witch, and the name stuck. As the months went on, visitors said the witch could imitate a neighbor's tone almost perfectly. She could match not just their words, but their pacing, their little quirks, a laugh at the end of a sentence, the way someone cleared their throat, even the rhythm of a local preacher's sermons. And this wasn't just happening in private. Word spread quickly through the Red River community that something was speaking in the Bell home. In a time and place where news traveled by word of mouth and church gossip, that alone was enough to draw people in. Curious neighbors started dropping by after supper, asking polite questions about crops and weather before finally admitting they were there to hear the witch. The stories say she rarely disappointed them. On some nights she sang hymns from start to finish, in a clear female voice that moved from verse to verse without a missed word. On others, she argued theology with visiting ministers, quoting long passages of scripture and then turning those same verses back on them in ways that left them rattled. People asked questions to test her. Some of those tests were simple. What did I have for breakfast? Or, where did I put my lost hammer? Others were more serious, involving private matters and family secrets. The answers, they claimed, were often right, uncomfortably right. Now, it's important to say that much of what we know about these conversations comes from later written accounts and retellings. We don't have recordings, obviously, and we don't have formal transcripts. What we do have are multiple people in the same community and across later decades insisting that they heard a voice in that house that behaved as if it knew them. Whatever you think that means, one thing is consistent across the stories. The witch had a personality. She could be funny and sarcastic. She could be cruel. She could flatter a guest one moment, then turn and insult John Bell in the next, calling him Old Jack, and mocking his appearance, his health, even his prayers. People traveled long distances to witness this for themselves. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others wanted to prove it was a trick. A few came sincerely fearful, convinced this was a sign of judgment or demonic activity. They didn't all leave with the same conclusion. Some walked away convinced the Bells had to be staging it, that someone in the family was throwing their voice, or that there was some clever trick hidden in the walls. Others swore there was no way a human could have tracked so many conversations, or kept up with so many details, or responded so quickly from every corner of the house. But there was one area where the stories line up almost perfectly. No matter what else the witch talked about, she never missed an opportunity to go after John Bell. She insulted him in front of guests. She threatened him when he was alone. She reportedly claimed he'd done something to deserve this, although what that was exactly seemed to shift depending on who was telling the story. What doesn't shift is this. The Bell Witch made it very clear that she wanted John Bell dead. And over time, John started to change in ways that made people wonder if she was getting what she wanted. As the voice in the Bell home became stronger, it also became meaner. And the person who bore the brunt of that shift wasn't John Bell, at least not at first. It was his daughter, Betsy. Betsy was the youngest of the Bell children, and by most accounts, a well-liked, bright girl. She was 12 when the haunting began, and she is the one family member whose experiences show up consistently across almost every version of the story, even in sources written long before the legend expanded into folklore. What happened to her wasn't subtle. According to the Bell family and several neighbors, Betsy would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. When her brothers rushed in with a candle, they claimed they'd find her hair twisted tightly around the bedposts or pulled so hard that it lifted her partially off the mattress. There were welts on her arms, red marks across her cheeks, scratches on her back in places she couldn't reach on her own. Different sources describe the severity differently. Some say she was slapped or pinched. Others describe full physical assaults. What they agree on is that something was happening in that room, and Betsy wasn't doing it herself. The witch didn't just torment her physically, she talked to her. Sometimes she'd call her name in a soft, almost childlike whisper. Other times, the tone turned mocking or threatening. One recurring detail in multiple accounts is that the witch seemed obsessed with Betsy's fear. She'd taunt her when she cried and congratulate herself when Lucy tried to comfort her. Over time, Betsy changed. People noticed she was quieter around neighbors. She spent less time with friends. She startled easily and became anxious when night fell, as if she'd already accepted the idea that the darkness belonged to someone else. And then the witch took an interest in something Betsy cared deeply about: a boy named Joshua Gardner. Joshua lived nearby, and he and Betsy had been close for years. They weren't engaged, they were young, but in the early 1800s, it wasn't unusual for families to talk openly about who their children might marry someday. It was innocent, hopeful talk, and by all accounts, both families approved of the match. The witch hated it, hated Joshua, hated the idea of Betsy being happy or building a future with him. The accounts say that whenever Joshua visited the Bell home, the witch would unleash a torrent of insults, attacking his looks, his character, even predicting misfortune if Betsy stayed with him. Sometimes she'd shout at him from the rafters. Other times, the voice came from just behind his shoulder. One evening, Betsy and Joshua met near the river with a few friends, normal for young people in that community. As the story goes, the air suddenly turned cold enough that everyone's breath became visible, and Betsy collapsed as if struck. When she came to, she was shaking violently, unable to speak, and the witch's voice, from somewhere above them, said plainly, "I'll kill him if you don't leave him." After that, Betsy wouldn't see Joshua alone. She wouldn't write him notes or walk with him after church. Eventually, she ended things with him entirely. Some people in the community believed it was the witch. Others thought Betsy was buckling under the emotional strain of being at the center of a town-wide sensation. A few whispered that someone in the family must have disapproved of the match and used the haunting to steer her away. There's no way to know the truth of that now. What we do know is that after Betsy ended her relationship with Joshua, the witch seemed pleased. She quieted down for a few days, at least around Betsy. But the relief didn't last. Because whatever the Bell Witch was, whatever you believe she represented, her attention was shifting to someone else in the house. Someone she claimed she had been sent to destroy: John Bell. By the time Betsy ended things with Joshua Gardner, John Bell was already beginning to change. People noticed it in small ways first. He tired easily. He lost weight. His hands shook when he tried to sign church documents or carve meat at the table. Lucy later said he seemed distracted, like he was listening for something no one else could hear. The symptoms progressed. One of the earliest written accounts describes John having sudden trouble speaking. He'd start to say something and his jaw would tighten, locking mid-sentence as if a muscle had seized. Sometimes he could force the words out after a few seconds. Other times he couldn't speak at all. The family believed he was ill, and by all appearances, he was. But the timing raised questions. Because every time John struggled, the witch made sure everyone knew. Guests in the Bell home said the witch would mock him at the moment his jaw froze. She'd laugh when he dropped utensils at dinner. She'd announce that he was too weak to pray or too stubborn to admit he was dying. And she kept repeating one message over and over in front of anyone who would listen. Old Jack Bell's end is near. Some people in Red River brushed it off as cruelty. Others saw it as a prophecy. A few believed the witch was causing the symptoms. That idea wasn't universal, but it wasn't rare either, especially among visitors who had heard her taunting him in real time. As John's health worsened, his world got smaller. He stopped walking the full length of the property. Then he stopped leaving the yard. Soon, he struggled to make it down the stairs without someone supporting him. On his worst days, neighbors found him lying in bed, barely responding. The witch never missed an opportunity to call attention to it. She'd rattle objects in the room when he drifted off. She'd mimic his groans. She'd tell Lucy the medicine they gave him was useless, or that she'd tampered with it. One detail appears consistently in both family recollections and later histories. The witch never expressed pity or concern for John Bell. Not once. Instead, the tone shifted from mockery to something colder, as if she were counting down. Meanwhile, the community didn't know what to make of John's condition. Rural medicine in the early 1800s had limits. A stroke, a neurological disorder, mercury poisoning from patent medicines. All of these were possible explanations. No one had the vocabulary for them at the time. But the timing was impossible to ignore. John Bell's decline happened in lockstep with the witch's threats. And the more his health failed, the more confident she seemed in predicting what would happen next. According to multiple accounts, she said openly, "I will kill him." The family tried everything available to them: prayer, clergy, herbal remedies, neighbors who came to sit by the bed. Nothing turned the illness around. And by late 1820, John Bell was bedridden almost constantly. His speech came in fragments. His memory faltered. He drifted between waking and sleep without knowing which was which. The witch stayed active the entire time. Some nights she talked for hours. Some nights she fell silent but stayed present, moving items in the room or tapping the bed frame as his breathing grew shallow. In almost every retelling, whether you believe it literally or see it as folklore, the Bell family agreed on this. John Bell believed the witch was going to kill him, and he believed there was nothing he could do to stop it. The final days of his life became the most controversial part of this entire case, because what happened next is the moment people point to when they argue the Bell Witch wasn't just a story, but something capable of acting on the world. And when we move into that final chapter, things get even stranger. By December of 1820, John Bell was rarely conscious for more than a few minutes at a time. His family took turns sitting by the bed. Lucy wiped his forehead with cool cloths. His sons tried to encourage him to eat or drink, though most of it spilled down his shirt because he could no longer control the muscles in his jaw. According to the family's own statements, the witch remained active the entire time. Sometimes she mocked him. Sometimes she stayed strangely quiet. Sometimes she recited hymns, not as comfort, but as if performing for visitors who crowded the hallway to hear whatever she might say next. It was clear John was not recovering. And on the morning of December 19th, he slipped into what his family believed was a final, deep sleep. Lucy tried to wake him. When he didn't respond, she went to the cupboard where they kept his medicine. She expected to see the small bottle they'd been using for weeks. Instead, she found something else. A small glass vial. It wasn't theirs. It had no label. And inside, it was a thin, dark liquid the family didn't recognize. In the version told by the Bells and recorded in later histories, they confronted the witch, asking what the vial was and how it had ended up where the medicine should have been. The witch responded immediately. "I gave him a dose of that last night." That line appears in multiple sources, but it's important to say this clearly. We don't have independent verification of what was in the vial or who put it there. What we do have is the family's testimony and an account of what they did next. To test whether the liquid was harmful, one of John's sons, sources differ on which, placed a drop of it onto the tongue of the family cat. The cat convulsed and died almost instantly. That detail, too, comes from the Bell family and from people who said they heard about it directly in the years afterwards. Whether the event happened precisely that way is impossible to prove now. But for the Bells, it was enough. They threw the vial into the fire where it reportedly cracked, hissed, and burned away within seconds. By that point, John Bell was breathing faintly, but he never regained consciousness. He died later that day with his family gathered around him. And according to the Bell family, on that same day, the witch's voice rang through the house in celebration. She announced he was dead. She claimed credit, and she said, "I told you I would kill him." When John Bell's funeral was held, the crowd was enormous. People from across the region attended. Ministers spoke. Neighbors grieved. And as the ceremony ended, as the final prayers were spoken and the mourners began walking back down the road, multiple people later said they heard a voice singing. A loud, clear woman's voice. The song, they claimed, was a drinking ballad. Something crude, something celebratory. It seemed to follow the procession all the way home. Whether every detail of that day happened exactly as written, whether memory blended with fear or folklore, that's part of the mystery. But this much is certain. John Bell died believing the Bell Witch had kept her promise. And the community around him never looked at that cabin or that family the same way again. After John Bell's death, the house grew quiet. Not silent, but quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. The constant conversations from the rafters, the taunts at night, the hymns, the shouting, all of it dropped off almost immediately. The family later said the witch stayed in the home for a short time after the funeral, long enough to make a few final remarks, almost like a guest preparing to leave. And then she was gone, just as suddenly as she had arrived. The Bell family did their best to return to normal life. Not all of them succeeded. Betsy, who had endured years of physical and emotional torment, eventually grew into adulthood. She married a man from a neighboring family, not Joshua Gardner, and moved away from Red River entirely. According to her descendants, she refused to talk about the witch. Neighbors who had once crowded around the Bell home had drifted back to their own concerns. A new generation of children was born. The church carried on. farms rose and fell. People remembered what happened, but the urgency faded. The witch, however, wasn't quite finished. In the Bell family's version of events, the one that appears in the earliest written summaries, the witch made a final announcement before she left the cabin. She said she would return in 7 years. And in 1828, the Bells claimed she did exactly that. Unlike the earlier years, this visit wasn't violent. Instead, she reportedly appeared to John Bell Jr., John's oldest surviving son, and spent nearly 3 weeks speaking with him. The topic she chose changed depending on the account. Some say she discussed the Bible. Others say she talked about the past and the future, offering predictions that were sometimes ambiguous and sometimes oddly specific. None of those predictions were recorded in detail, and we don't know how seriously John Jr. took them. What we do know is that he later claimed the witch's return was real, though far less dramatic than the earlier haunting. After those 3 weeks, she left again, and this time, she didn't give a date for her next visit. Over the next few decades, the Bell Witch slipped into local memory. People told the story in front of fireplaces during long winters. They repeated it at church gatherings or passed it down casually to their children, the way families pass down warnings or odd bits of history. The details shifted over time, as they do with any oral tradition, but the core remained: a voice in the dark, a family under siege, a death no one could explain, and a promise that still hung over the land. In the late 1800s, more than 50 years after the events, parts of the legend were written down in county histories and small press books. Many of these accounts were based on interviews with older residents who claimed they either remembered the story directly or had heard it from someone who witnessed the events firsthand. The written version expanded the narrative, adding color, dialogue, and interconnected stories, some of which can't be verified. But the heart of it, the part people in the region kept repeating, was simple. Something spoke in that house. Something that knew things it shouldn't have known. And something that John Bell believed could kill him did. To this day, the land around the old Bell property remains connected to the legend. Not because people still hear voices in the night, but because the story never really left. It stayed in the community. It stayed in the families who descended from those early settlers. And in some places, it stayed in the landscape itself. Whether you believe the Bell Witch was a spirit, an invention, a warning, or the result of a community wrestling with something deeper, the impact she left is undeniable. More than 2 centuries later, she is still one of the most talked about figures in American folklore, and the only haunting in early U.S. history where people openly claimed they heard a ghost speak. There's one more piece of the Bell Witch story that most people today associate with the legend, even though it doesn't appear in the earliest accounts. About a mile from the old Bell property sits a small cave along the Red River. Locals started connecting it to the witch long after the family's haunting had ended. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, stories emerged claiming the witch lived there, or used the cave as a hiding place, or appeared to groups of children who ventured inside. None of those stories show up in contemporary records from the 1810s or 1820s. But the cave became part of the legend anyway, not because it was involved in the original haunting, but because it became a physical anchor point for a story that had lived mostly in memory and community lore. Today, people visit the Bell Witch Cave the way people visit any site tied to a famous haunting, to feel closer to history, to the fear, or simply to the idea of what might once have happened there. Whether the cave had any role in the original events, or whether it became a way for later generations to keep the story alive, depends on who you ask. But like everything else connected to the Bell Witch, its importance comes from the people who believed in it and kept telling the story long after the voices in the Bell cabin went silent. Stories like the Bell Witch survive because people don't agree on what happened. Even in the 1800s, when the events were fresh, the community was split. Some believed the Bells were targeted by a spirit with a purpose. Others thought the family misinterpreted stress, illness, or grief, especially in a time when medicine couldn't explain half of what people experienced. And then there are the details that only show up in later written histories, the parts that feel a little too polished or a little too dramatic. That doesn't mean the whole thing was invented. It just means that stories grow, especially when they pass through decades of retelling, through families and neighbors, and through generations that weren't there but still felt connected to what happened. What stands out to me is this: the Bells believed something was speaking to them. They believed it so strongly that it shaped the way they interpreted illness, conflict, and fear. It shaped the way their neighbors behaved. It even shaped their memories as they look back on those years. Whether the Bell Witch was a spirit, a shared hallucination, a coping mechanism, or something else entirely, the impact was real. People heard a voice. People claimed it knew things it shouldn't. And a family watched their father decline while that voice promised he would die. There's a line somewhere between folklore and reality. And with the Bell Witch, that line never stayed still for very long. Maybe that's why the story still matters. It isn't just a ghost tale. It's a story about how belief spreads, how fear spreads, and how a community reacts when something challenges the boundaries of what they think is possible. And maybe the reason the Bell Witch still haunts American folklore is because she forces us to consider a question people were wrestling with 200 years ago. If an entire community hears the same voice, how much of that can we dismiss? This has been State of the Unknown. If you found tonight's story compelling, unsettling, or it made you think a little differently about the boundaries between folklore and reality, I hope you'll share it with someone who'd appreciate it too. New episodes drop every week, and if you haven't already, make sure you're following the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss what's coming next. And if you're enjoying the show, the best way you can help is by leaving a rating or review. They really do help. On Spotify, it's just a tap. And on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a written review to tell me what you think. I read every one. You can also connect with me on social media for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more stories from the shadows. Thank you for listening and for exploring the unknown with me. And until next time, stay curious, stay unsettled, and keep your eyes open, because even the faintest voice can change a life or end one.